Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is. I'm Peter Whittle. Now my guest today is the author and journalist Ed West. Ed has written for numerous publications, The Times, Telegraph. He's a regular at the Spectator. He's currently the deputy editor of UnHerd, and he's also an author. He wrote a book a few years ago called The Diversity Illusion: What We Got Wrong About Immigration and How to Set It Right. His new book is called Small Men on the Wrong Side of History: The Decline, Fall and Unlikely Return of Conservatism. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me,
very
Peter.
much. Thank you. The title is actually a quote from Obama, isn't it? About
Al-Qaeda.
About Al-Qaeda.
Yes. So,
But how does it chime with your book then? Who are the small men?
well, the reference was to basically the overview of the book is that conservatives, even though they do tend to win elections, have sort of lost every political and cultural argument for the last few decades, and this is a sort of series of defeats going back about 50 or 60 years. I mean, the small men on the wrong side of history, the quote got me because of this basic idea that progressivism has, which is that we're moving towards, a future where they're going to win and everything's going to turn out their way. And they often say that people who disagree with them are on the wrong side of history. And in the future, you're going to be seen as losers and bigots, and there'll be films about how you guys are the baddies, and that's how conservatives are cast. And that's a sort of idea that progressivism gets from Christianity, which is, one of the themes of the books, and it's not a particularly original thought, is that the left is basically a heresy of Christianity, and that's where their ideas come from, and they're continuing that. And as Christianity has declined, that's pretty much the main reason why the left has become so much more dominant, because it's become a sort of default religion for most people, especially university-educated people anyway.
And you're saying as well in the book, are you not, that basically it's not going to change? I mean, that's to begin with, at least, it's quite a sort of pessimistic outlook. I'm
quite a pessimistic person. Yes, there is at the end. Well, because the problem is with many problems with the modern media is that everyone thinks they're losing, right? So everyone watches the news and thinks. And there's studies of this even the other day where both Democrats and Republicans by quite wide margins think they're losing everything. So there is signs of conservatism coming back. I mean, Brexit and Trump were signs where conservatives actually won arguments, small c conservatives. And so obviously liberals and progressives in the media think, oh, well, how can you say, you're losing, you're doing really well. So, well, this is a sort of, in many ways, it's almost like a last gasp, because on both those counts, the demography is against the conservatives. Brexit voters are simply older. Same with Trump voters. Amongst younger Americans, they are much more progressive than the older ones, and they're much less religious. But there is also the counter thing where identity politics is repulsing a lot of people as well. Amongst young white Americans, they seem to be moving to Republicans. Only amongst men for various reasons at the moment, and that's in reaction to just the sort of I guess, overshoot of progressive politics. It's become too obsessed with identity. It's become basically like a religion, and a lot of people are. So that's when I say the unlikely return of conservatism. That's my sort of small note of optimism at the end.
So the basically people just simply get fed up and rebel against this.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit. Because once young people especially liked being countercultural. So I'm a bit reluctant saying a conservative is like countercultural, but they are in certain ways. In that, after everyone in the arts likes to think they're rebelling against this, this powerful patriarchy or this sort of elite they're against. But it's no denying that the arts in Britain are left dominated. You can't say anything that's too left wing that's going to shock anyone. It's just, but people still hang on to this construction. And likewise with comedy. And the reason comedy has become quite tiresome is because there's nothing really to make a joke about. There's nothing to be alternative about, because most comedies now is comedians laughing at people further down the social scale than them, the gammons. This is kind of a thing that
punching down, I think.
They say, oh, we're punching up, but not really, because I go to comedy clubs. All my favourite comedians are basically centre-left. Although I did see, your guy, Constantine, he was pretty funny. But I'll go to a comedy club and it's just a comedian talking to other sort of university-educated centre-left people about how stupid lower middle class people in the Midlands are. That's the underlying message. So that's not really that's not really rebellion. So naturally, amongst certain younger people, there is a sort of rejection of that. And so where are they going to go? I mean, inevitably, they go to whatever's anti that. Well, whether you call it right wing, I'm not entirely sure. But
the thing is you mentioned the answer. There was, the arts being left wing. There's actually been a report out a couple of weeks ago. It was in the Times, which not only sort of proved this to be true, something we know to be true, but that in fact it's become incredibly restricted and people actually being shut down, as it were. If they voted Brexit, or if they've got any views on transgenderism. This came out, and I think Richard Morrison wrote a piece in the Times. He's the arts editor for the Times, saying basically, this is a problem in the left.
Sure. I mean, the survey said 1 in 6 people in the arts said they can't say. I assume a large amount of that is to do with the transgender issue, because there's no way 1 in 6 people are right wing in the arts. It's going to be much lower than that. I think like 4% of artists voted Brexit. And so this comes down to, one of the problems you get there is the viewpoint diversity thing, which is a kind of contended issue. But if you look at the universities in the 60s, in both Britain and America, there was a sort of left-wing dominance because liberal-minded people tend to be higher in openness, the personality trait, which correlates with artistic ability. So the arts is always going to be slightly left-dominated, and that's fine. So the universities were like 3-1, 2-1. So about a third of people voted either Conservative over here or Republican. I mean, now in the States, it's in the region of 15-1 in certain fields, 50-1 in some. In Britain, about 9-10% of university professors now vote Conservative, and they're going to be much older on average. And the ones coming through, none of them are going to be. And so there is the point about, on the basic front, is that in any area where you don't have a viewpoint diversity, the quality is going to be worse. I mean, there have been studies on Wikipedia pages when they're made by people with 2 different political views, the quality is much better because they sort of test each other. But also you just get to the point where our universities basically returning to their original function, which was religious organisation. All universities started off as religious. Oxford and Cambridge Church of England. It wasn't until the 1830s we had a university here that you didn't have to be Anglican to go to. In the States, all the different universities were started by churches. So the idea that you can go to university and have 3 thought is quite a novel one and kind of against our nature, because I think in a certain sense, humans don't like disagreement. It's something we have to discipline ourselves to make ourselves put up with it. So unless we make an effort to have that viewpoint diversity, then inevitably these institutions will become not just biased, but they also become political issues as well. The right will dislike them and the left will side with them, and that's also happening in the States, where far more Republicans now think universities are a bad thing, which is an unusual, unprecedented thing.
You mentioned actually in the book, or you made the comparison that what's happened with conservatism, and by that I'm distinct from the Tory party.
The Tory party's doing quite well, so which is bad for my book.
Exactly. But what you say is that this is not unlike the Reformation, maybe. I mean, if you could explain that a bit. I think I know what you mean, but that essentially it's a generational change. Right.
So, Europe has had. I make 2 comparisons historically. One is the Christian takeover of Rome, and when I'm talking about these historical comparisons, I'm not making direct comparisons because I think they're quite difficult in history, but they're sort of analogies to explain our current situation. So, with the Reformation, a sort of moral revolution took place. Certain people believed in this new system, so Protestantism, which had variations across Europe, which was quite revolutionary, overthrowing the authorities, making new authorities, turning back on certain old established views, celibacy and transubstantiation. But certain people held on to these, and so across Europe you had this kind of division, which was suddenly new. And then it was a lot of it to do with pamphlets. There were these pamphlet wars attacking the other side, and it became more and more bitter as people's identity became strongly attached to Catholic and Protestant, which were new identities. I think, especially since the Brexit vote, we've seen Remain and Leave identities become much, much stronger than Tory and Labour votes. I mean, people by any measurement are much more likely to strongly Remain, especially Remain. Funnily enough, they have a much stronger group identity.
Why is that, do you think?
I don't know. I suppose it's because, I think a certain type of person below a certain age in Britain and across the West, they see their membership of being a sort of educated, liberal-minded, a sort of worldwide group. That they have more in common with someone who's a liberal in Germany than they will their neighbour who's a conservative and didn't go to university. And I think maybe it's the lack of awareness that this is actually identity, because they're supposed to be beyond identity, because nationalism is a bad thing, because nationalism killed 70 million people in 2 wars. But I think the lack of awareness means that people don't realise that actually this is a new identity, and it's actually much closer to the Reformation era religious identities, where a Protestant in England would go and fight with Protestants in Holland or Germany against Catholic English people, because that identity was much stronger than national identity. So people can adopt these things. So then political identity becomes now the replacement for national identity. Right. So in America is far ahead of us, but we've caught up quite quickly, which makes me slightly pessimistic, because Republican and Democrat identity in America is now so strong, and their hostility towards the other group, polls showing people they want a member of the other party marrying into their family. All these kind of things. They think the other party are less evolved. They think they haven't got the country's interest. They're a danger to the country, and there are all these indices of the political warmth and political coldness. How do you rate your own party? How do you rate the other party? Democrats and Republicans don't like their own party any more than they did 30 years ago, but their hostility towards the others has gone up so much. And I do think this kind of ideology, this tribalism, is so much in us that we can allow politics to take the role that religion or national identity once did.
Yeah. This is actually quite a personal book, isn't it?
Right, yes,
memoir is pitching it a bit strong.
Yeah, but there's
essentially
elements,
your own experience sort of goes through the whole thing. I mean, when did you become a conservative, or were you? I mean, there's this idea of Jonathan Haidt's idea that somehow there is this conservative mind and there is a left-wing mind.
Right, yeah.
I'm very sceptical about that. But were you born? Would you call yourself right-wing or conservative, or what?
I think both are probably fair enough.
Yeah. Were you born that way, or was it conditioning?
I mention a lot of what I mention what the psychology world says about this,
yes.
And I do try to step back a bit, partly because a lot of psychological findings turn out to be nonsense, and that's how they're crumbling it. But I'm not a psychologist, but there is an argument that so conservatism is a political philosophy, but it's also a sort of state of mind as well. So conservatives do tend to have these personality traits, more conscientious.
I was going to say, what do you think they are? What are the basic traits then?
So the main thing is that the five big personality traits. There are 2 where there are differences between liberals and conservatives. Liberals tend to be more higher on openness, which means they try new things. Liberals in America, for example, there's a study last week, they're 6 times more likely to try cannabis than conservatives. Right. They're more like open-minded, they're more likely to go travelling, they're more likely to do all these things and find out about the world. Conservatives tend to be more conscientious, so they'll turn up on time to stuff like that. Notice I was early today. That was my. I hate being late for that stuff, right? The other three traits: extroversion, neurosis, agreeability. They don't tend to.
Neurosis.
Yes. Well, really? I think there is some Green Party voters are the most neurotic, but I don't think there's a huge left-wing divide on that, or right-wing divide. So there is. So anyway,
neurosis,
yes,
and you mentioned also
there's agreeableness.
Agreeability. Right. So how would you illustrate that?
These are just what the world of psychology said. This is the 5 personality traits they measure, and they do various tests on people.
But what I'm saying is, are they sort of? Does that mean that conservatives are more agreeable people? Or
conservatives and liberals are about the same on agreeable levels, right? So it's just the 2. It's just openness and conscientiousness, where there is some.
Right.
There is a consistent. Like, for example, you can tell someone's political with a quite high accuracy just looking at a desk. If someone's got a really neat desk, they're much more likely to be right-wing than if someone's got a messy desk. So, not a huge accuracy, but more than 50%. So you can tell with certain, it's like The Odd Couple. You could in that film, you could probably say one of them is going to be Republican, one Democrat, right? So I mentioned the memoir, but because I think it's like jaded about politics, and I find reading political arguments after a bit tiring. So I just wanted to make it a bit of a personal story to make it, you know, a bit lighter. But also, I sort of wanted to have a bit of understand why I was never a liberal, because I wasn't one of these cool people who I really envy, who are liberal and, you know, when they're young and then become conservative. That's the right way, right? So that's like the Christopher Hitchens of this world, you know, sort of. And, you know, they're sort of like the ex-smokers, aren't they? So, you know, do it when you're young and grow up. So I was always quite conservative right wing. I never really saw the appeal of liberalism as an idea.
I mean, for example, sort of youthful adolescent rebellion, right, against the parents or against authority or whatever. Quite often I feel that some on the left have sort of never left that behind.
Right, okay, yeah, I think there's certain truth in that, yeah.
But did you sort of rebel?
No, my parents were incredibly lax and easygoing. You know, my mum used to buy me fags when she went on holiday when I was a teenager. I just had nothing to rebel against in that sense. I did go to a very strict comprehensive school though. I think that had I do mention, you know, that in the book, because I think that had a big sort of psychological effect on me, because I came to think, well, actually authority is quite protective, because if there wasn't for this authority, this school, lots of comprehensive at the time, the 90s, were just crumbling, sort of, they were dystopian, you know, post-hellish places where the kids were throwing stones at the teachers. And our school was incredibly well run, and loads of people got really good results, and it was thanks to the headmaster and his kind of 1990s, his Mayor Giuliani style zero tolerance policy. And I think that probably influenced my politics. I think that's quite a good thing, isn't it, right?
Yes. I mean, I suppose the point really is I mean, I remember growing up not feeling hugely rebellious, not in that way anyway. But I suppose as well, freedom, you know, is not about chaos necessarily, is it? Freedom, you could justify by saying that freedom is in your head, you know, it's basically how much you have in your head.
And I suppose it's about testing boundaries as well, isn't it, right?
Yes.
So that's because chaos, ultimately, there's not much fun in chaos.
Well, we're sounding remarkably like Jordan Peterson here, aren't we? I mean, this is where what obviously he talks about. What about your own life then? I mean, do you, for example, being a conservative, have you felt like a leper, social leper? I mean, have you felt that you are, you know, the man on the outside in your own social life?
A little bit. I do live in a very Remainer-y part of London as well. I managed to find one other Brexit voter amongst here. After about 3 or 4 years, we finally worked out. I mean, there are loads of... I mean, partly I started writing this book. It was actually after reading The Righteous Mind, so I thought that sort of inspired me to think, you know, why do I get annoyed about people who I think are just wrong about politics? And I think we shouldn't... There's no point getting annoyed because they just think differently. But I'm just so used to these social situations where people will be in a social setting and they don't really know me and they don't know politics, and people will just naturally assume, like, hey, what about those conservatives, those idiots and everything? And I would just keep my mouth shut normally. And it's quite a normal thing. And I think if you're a certain age and in certain circles in London, that's just sort of the thing, right? You're going to be the only conservative. There might be one other guy who's secretly conservative as well, but they keep their mouth shut as well. So
I sort of get the impression slightly that you almost wish you weren't conservative.
I wonder about that. Yeah, if I could take a magic pill, I think.
Why? Because life would be easier, or what?
I think it would be. I think there's definitely some stress in having an unpopular opinion, and having a minority opinion. No one likes to be unpopular. I mean, this is one reason I think Taleb's point about journalists being very conformist people and very not very sort of thinking outside the box people in politics, and you know, it comes to the thing where journalism is very left-wing, because I think, you know, journalists want to be popular, right? So they always want to see, I want to have the popular opinion, the high status opinion that everyone's going to value me for. So if you're quite conservative, the only option is to kind of go down to the road of becoming like the ogre, and there's obviously a market for that, and you can become an ogre. But I mean, personally, I don't really want to be an ogre.
Didn't you nearly work for Breitbart?
Right, yeah. So I do come to that. So I interviewed by Steve Bannon. Before I'd never even heard of him, and he just said it was like 2014, and he was just shouting down the phone a lot, very, very, just never stopped talking. And it was a very well-paid job, and he just kept saying, "Well, Ed, you know, we're going to put our own guy. We're going to overthrow the Republican Party, and we're going to put our own guy in the White House. We're going to have our own nationalist guy from outside the deadwood of the Republican elite." And it's 2014. I thought, what is this guy on about? He'll never get some complete outsider who no one's ever heard of into the White House, and then
hey presto.
Yeah, so I was completely wrong. But no, I turned it down because I just thought there's through James Dellenpall, who I like a lot, who I think is a really good writer. But with once mainstream journalism becomes this kind of group-thinky thing, the only alternative amongst sort of alternative conservative media has become much more sensationalist, and that's the only sort of way to sort of get attention, and I just didn't really want to be part of that. I think that's I found that morally troubling a little bit. So yeah, I turned that down. But yeah, that was part of my journey. You
also say in the book, actually, it's quite strong. Actually, you say that conservatism, small c, conservative views or instincts are actually sort of considered quite repellent to many people. That's really very, very strong, isn't it? I mean,
oh yeah, but I think it's true though. I mean, I'm always surprised by. Well, firstly, I think a lot of people people are repelled by what they don't know, and so once people enter these social circles, and I think this is quite a new thing because they were more mixed 20 years ago, where they just don't meet anyone who's conservative, and the ideas are even so alien to them. Then when they hear them, it's just like, hold on a minute, what? You think people should be restricted from coming to this country because they're not from this country or something? All this even kind of basic stuff becomes repellent. And I think that is basically because they don't meet that many.
Well, we recently did a show with young people on the right, who are coming up.
Yeah.
And basically, I felt they'd slipped through the net almost.
Right, okay.
But what they related, I mean, was it just that everybody, in terms of education around them, was entirely left wing.
Right. Yeah.
So that this is a change, isn't it?
Yeah. It's
you're saying
it's much more,
and that people
extreme.
Are not going on to change their views. Your friends, for example, your own friends are around your age.
Yeah, they're not. And I think that's a social thing because once they don't meet any conservatives, that even if they do have slight inclination, especially once they sort of settle down, they don't identify as conservative, certainly. And they sort of keep conservative ideas at arm's length because they just don't meet anyone socially. So there's no way for those. I think ideas and politics are transmitted on a sort of one-to-one basis, much more than most people don't get their ideas from reading a political tract. It was either friends of theirs, people they trust, people they look up to. Social proof, I think, happens much more. That's why I think culture is much more important. I mean, that's why what you do is so important. I think you are on the right track about this all the time.
We were
ahead of the curve.
Time,
no, because exactly, because it doesn't matter how many political arguments you can make in a dry textbook. If the cultural values are the ones that transmit, and people remember films, they remember books, and those are now much more on the left than they used to be. And I mean, I think that's a problem for us, basically.
You wrote, as I mentioned in the introduction, a book called The Diversity Illusion a while ago. That was actually pretty much before its time, I think, wasn't it? I got the impression it was sort of, it was neglected, sort of ignored. Is that?
I think so. I mean, every author thinks that about their books, right?
It was reviewed, but it was actually quite a hard-hitting book, wasn't it? About.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's done my career much good. I mean, that was like, I was 35 when that came out. I was really 33 when I wrote it. And most of my social network would just think, oh, great, yeah, immigration, diversity, brilliant. And I think I was probably very unusual in thinking, I don't think this is like a very good idea, what we're doing. Where does this end? What are the cost benefits? Why make all these risks? And I think that, obviously, that's my conservative instinct. I think if you're going to make a radical change, most likely that radical change is going to be a bad thing. Small changes are usually fine, but it wasn't. It's got various good, nice quotes from people down the years, and but yes, it's. It
was quite a brave book, actually. I think at the time. It was actually looking at the whole thing of diversity as well, which I'd say. I mean, you read this 7 years ago.
Yeah.
I would say that diversity now it's become such a thing. It's almost like a fetish. It is just there all the time in every part of life. This is being pushed. Diversity is our strength. So
and now project back to the histories.
Yes, exactly.
Very strange. Yeah, I find it very strange. But I mean, I think I mean, I suppose you say the argument's ahead of its time, but I think maybe the dial's even move further. I mean, maybe people will read that in 5 years' time who are in their 20s will just think, wow, this guy's like insane. Even more so than usual. Because the arguments are just dying out. I mean, I suppose my problem with diversity is that once you make diversity like a good in itself, there is no end point, right? So there's always more diversity because you can't have any immigration restrictions that reduce diversity, and you can't do anything that will reduce diversity. It will always go up and up and up. And at what point do you say, okay, enough? Like there is no end point, and no one's really thought that through as a sort of as a future. So I mean, like if it's like that now, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I was thinking about the other day. There was I think back in the Goodness Gracious Me, the sketch show in the early 20s. Now I might have misinterpreted, but they have a sketch where it's the Great Escape, and they're making a film, and there's Asian guys in the Great Escape, and this is not to do in 1917 because I think 1917 there were Sikh soldiers and that's fine. So that's not a good point. But I just wonder, will future generations even understand that joke about like sort of making something that's historically inaccurate, anachronistic for the sake of diversity? Because now it's just sort of screened as a sort of part of our national story. I find it a very strange thing.
Well, it is sort of, I mean, I think the BBC this week talked about repurposing classics. I mean, this Orwellian word, repurposing. I didn't even know there was.
Why don't they just, produce new stories?
Yes.
I mean, there are lots of writers out there who would love to write something.
Yes, it is.
And, you can make, I mean, it's been done, make an Austen novel but set in the modern age, the same storyline. That's been done before. It's not a huge thing, but you're right. It's sort of retconning history. It's very strange.
You're saying, or it seemed that you were saying there that basically the book, The Diversity Illusion, the arguments in this are, will seem very old-fashioned in 5 years. You said maybe.
Maybe because we lose. The argument's been lost already. So, a generational thing.
But in the new book, you do see chinks of light, right?
Yeah, I don't know if they're chinks of light.
Or is that just you want to appear optimistic or what?
I do think, there will always be, poles in politics. So whatever's the establishment, there will be something against that. And I think once conservatism starts, so conservatism, one of the key points of it is institutions, right? So we believe in institutions. That it's, monarchy is a great example. The law courts, parliament, even BBC, as much as we have our disagreements with it. These are all institutions, and all the the little platoons, all these tiny things. But once they become these institutions inherently dominated by progressives, as they almost all have, then conservatism becomes sort of unravelled, and it becomes a bit more, I suppose, revolutionary. It becomes so all these, a lot of the sort of Trump followers, both in his administration and his supporters, are sort of anarchic, really. They want to sort of blow things up a little bit. They're radical conservatives. And a lot of that makes me feel uncomfortable. We get a little, populism in the continent is a bit like that. And I think that has a slightly nastier edge to it. And it's a bit unconstrained, that's the thing. It's a bit deinstitutionalized. So I do worry that what is going to come in succession on the right to, mainstream conservatism.
Would you therefore class someone like Dominic Cummings as being in that category? I mean, he's not, but he doesn't like institutions. He wants to change them all. But he's on the right. I think he's essentially right, isn't he? I mean, I would say his analysis of institutions. He wants to shake them up, and he wants to. I get the impression he wants to sort of, do the march to the institutions, but backwards, right? And no one's ever really tried this. We've had 10 years of Tory MPs in Downing Street, and there's almost no institution or department which is not overwhelmingly dominated by non-conservatives. I mentioned in my book, how many conservatives were appointed to panels or organisations. I think of Roger Scruton, they sacked him after a hatchet job. Like in comparison, all these bodies are entirely dominated by sort of Labour supporting appointees. And I just think I think Dominic Cummings is a sign of, in the future, maybe people on the right say, well, we should do that as well. And, I hesitate to think it's a good idea, because I think it's just going to get it could get a bit nasty, the whole thing. But then if one side of, a political debate are doing something, the other side are inevitably going to do it, aren't they? I suppose one way would be to build your own institutions. That's
right.
The other thing.
So that's one thing that's happening in the States.
Yes.
With some of the universities, they're building their own. I mean, the problem is we already have that with a sort of example of that in the media in the States, and it's just not a very attractive prospect. Sort of a Fox News dominated. I mean, this is why I'm very sceptical of the idea of even privatizing or defunding the BBC, because I just think what replaces it will be more like CNN, which is much more politically repellent. I think the BBC has quite a lot of controls in it. I mean, it's inevitably going to be quite centre-left because that's the establishment voice, and the BBC is always the establishment voice, but it does have controls, it does try to be restrained, while I think a private version of the BBC would just be basically catering to the self-regard of, the sort of metropolitan, urban, educated people, just the way CNN does, and it's just garbage.
Although the need to keep going without a license fee could change that. I mean, this is the whole point. If you get rid of the license fee, then you're not protected. In a way.
But I mean, they can easily, I reckon, amongst young people, 30 or 40% of the population who would ingest like BuzzFeed style garbage on their television, and so you would just have that instead, and there'd probably be like a Fox News equivalent, and then.
I think that might be your dislike of Fox might be the gentleness of conservatism.
Right. Yeah.
Out.
So this is again where I think of myself a small man on the wrong side of history, because I think of that gentleness in conservatism might be like obsolete. It might not function anymore. That kind of old, let's all just act like we're in a club. I think that might be on the way out. So.
Well, I should say, before we sign off, the book is not, it's very amusing, and it's not full of doom, is it?
No, it's fine.
We shouldn't be doom laden.
No.
It's Small Men on the Wrong Side of History again. This is it. You can get it on Amazon, and it's a great read. I'm sure it will resonate with many of you watching. Thank you very much
for
coming in. Thanks very much. That's it for now. Please do, as I always say every week, please do subscribe, won't you? And we'll see you next time. Thank you.